Thank you for the kind introduction. Mr. Chairman of the ICD, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I will speak about democracy in times of war. No peace without democracy. No democracy without peace. These were the slogans that inspired many in the peace movement of the last century, in the final decades of the Cold War in particular. That era's democratic peace theory saw itself in the legacy of the great philosopher of enlightenment, Immanuel Kant from Königsberg, now Kaliningrad in Russia. In his essay on perpetual peace, Zum ewigen Frieden, he had explained that only a polity where the citizens have a say as to whether there should be war or not, in his original words, ob Krieg sein solle oder nicht, only such a system where the citizens can ultimately decide on this choice offers the prospect of peace, in Kant's opinion, a peace that is durable and more than a temporary ceasefire or a temporary cessation of arms. Kant identified such a system as republican, where decisions are made by those who directly have to bear the consequences of their decisions, and not by a distant ruler who is not personally affected by the devastating effects of war, for instance. What Kant described as a republican system, as opposed to a despotic one, where there is no separation of powers, in our time is commonly being referred to as representative democracy. That's how people would describe the system, for instance, also here in Germany and in most of the European countries. However, if we look at the historical facts, at the events of the last few decades, we must admit that it was not only despotic states, to use the Kantian term, but also states which define themselves as democracies that engaged in large-scale wars, indeed a multitude of military interventions that were often justified simply by references to democracy, human rights, or the preservation of peace. I would add here a war to defend peace, as is also now spoken about today. A war to defend peace would indeed be a contradictio in adjecto, a contradiction in itself. These conflicts, especially in the decades since the end of the Cold War, have destabilized vast regions of the globe and have triggered new conflicts that pose serious risks to global peace also now in the beginning of the 21st century. So we have to ask ourselves, was the democratic peace theory wrong in the idealistic equation of democracy and peace? Or is the obvious contradiction between idea and reality the result of an error in the classification of the respective state systems? Also, one might ask, was the assumption of Immanuel Kant misplaced, so to speak? In order to bring clarity to this issue, we need to examine the terminology. That means we have to reflect on the very notion of democracy. Only conceptual precision which is the prerequisite of intellectual honesty, will enable us to deal with the challenges to democracy in times of war. I mean, to properly identify and understand these challenges in such situations that threaten to undermine the entire edifice of our modern understanding of state legitimacy, which is informed, as I said, by democracy and also by the rule of law. And that brings me to the second part of my reflection, namely on the specific conceptual element, because we need to be clear about the concept before we can make any further assessment on the relationship between or on the conditions of democracy in a situation of peace. The term that has been incorporated in so many different languages, modern languages, was created in ancient Greece. I mean, that's commonplace. The literal meaning of demokratia is rule of the people, not rule on behalf of the people or rule for the people. Although most political or most polities that define themselves as democracies fall under the latter category, namely are systems where decisions are made on behalf of the people. As Rousseau has noticed already before the French Revolution, direct rule of the people as a community of citizens is only feasible when the group is small. In communities of millions, or as it is today, hundreds of millions, the will of the citizens needs to be expressed via representation. By way of elections, the people of a state authorizes delegates to legislate, of course for a limited period of time, not indefinitely. Ideally, this kind of representation should be exercised on the basis of an imperative mandate, binding the deputy to the preferences of the electorate, as those preferences are expressed in elections on the basis of the programs that are offered by those who are competing in the elections. In political reality, however, the legislators act on the basis of an imperative mandate, not in regard to their electors, but an imperative mandate in regard to the political parties or interest groups that have nominated them or sponsored their campaign. This brings in an element of oligarchy, often also in the form of plutocracy, that undermines the very ideal of popular rule, albeit in its mediated or indirect form. It was President Dwight D. Eisenhower who, in his farewell address of 17th of January 1961, warned of the destructive effect of vested interests in a democratic polity. And I briefly quote from his speech. He said, "In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist." End quote. As democracy, for organizational reasons, as I said, can only be practiced by way of approximation to the ideal of direct rule by the people, decision-making by representation should be strictly independent of lobbies and interest groups. That is also the meaning, the wider meaning of President Eisenhower's statement. Unfortunately, the reality, also in the Western world, points in the opposite direction, and war, whether actual or planned or strategically intended, war has often in history been the catalyst for the mobilization of these vested interests, to the detriment of democratic representation that all too often will become a mere execution of interests that are neither publicly declared nor democratically legitimized. To make a proper and honest assessment of the impact of war on democracy, that means on decision-making that aspires to conform to the will of the people, whether expressed directly or indirectly, we should reflect in more detail on the democratic idea and what it implies for the organization of the polity, that means of the state community. We speak here of requirements that are universal, irrespective of socio-cultural differences, once we have agreed on the principle of people's rule in general. The freedom that is inherent in people's rule is an essential human right in whichever culture we live or socio-cultural environment we live. The essence of democracy is freedom of the individual, but not in an isolated way. The individual as citizen of a state, as member of a community. The freedom to decide makes only sense, first, if the citizen has access to relevant information. This is the requirement of transparency. Second, if the citizen can share his or her opinion without any manipulation or ideological indoctrination. And this, of course, will exclude all forms of propaganda. And third, if he or she can express the opinion and assert the will in referenda or elections free from fear. That is absolutely essential, especially now we can see how important that is concerning the debates going on in Europe now over the issue of war and peace. For the first time in the course of the First World War, more than 100 years ago, the techniques of public communication in support of a war effort were carefully studied and consequently gradually refined. And this related to the mobilization for the war effort of the Allied States, and particularly the United States, during the First World War. Unavoidably, mobilization of public opinion in a war is antithetic to the requirements of meaningful decision-making in a democracy, which always must be prudent and sober, I would say. Edward Bernays, by the way, a nephew of Sigmund Freud, a double nephew even of Sigmund Freud, in his book entitled Propaganda, 1928, has, with surprising honesty in today's terms, described this form of manipulation as engineering consent. I repeat, engineering consent of the masses. In his opinion, I quote briefly, the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. End quote. It goes without saying that on the basis of our understanding of democracy, we cannot agree with this assessment. What Bernays describes is an essential aspect, or modus operandi, of oligarchy, of an oligarchic society, which is especially pertinent and consequential in a state of war. In the words of Bernays again, I quote, "Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country." End quote. And he meant by our country, he meant the United States. This is exactly what President Eisenhower, who as Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force in Europe during World War II, had gone through the horrors of war, what he had solemnly warned against, in the words I just quoted a few minutes ago. Again, now in 2023, the world is faced with such a threat of undeclared interests on all sides of the divide. One should not be hypocritical and self-righteous. As regards the earlier mentioned requirement of any decision that is democratically meaningful, namely access to unbiased information, today's leaders should also pay attention to the wisdom of Samuel Johnson, the great 18th century English writer. And I briefly quote from him, because it is so pertinent to what we are faced with now. He said, "Among the calamities of war may be jointly numbered the diminution of the love of truth by the falsehoods which interest dictates and credulity encourages," end quote. Or one could say more simply, or one could refer more simply to a dictum which is often attributed to Rudyard Kipling, namely, the first casualty of war is truth. And that brings me, in the third part of my presentation, to a description of what the challenges to democracy are in that specific context. As is implied in the freedom of decision, there is an intricate nexus of truth and democracy. Meaningful participation in public life is simply impossible if people are denied access to information. And one could say more specifically access to relevant information, or if they are prevented from communicating with people, citizens, on the other side in a situation of conflict or war. This has been proven one of the most serious predicaments of democracy under the conditions of war. In our global era, with the threat of arms of mass destruction, propaganda and denial of access to information are not only an impediment to democracy in an abstract sense, but are an existential challenge to our common humanity. In a constellation of conflict, such as the one we are again witnessing here in Europe, democratic prudence, nurtured by the wisdom of the informed citizen, is all too easily and quickly subordinated to and eventually eliminated by the furor of war. As always in such constellations, propaganda attributes the blame exclusively to the other side. As we say in German, Schwarz-Weiß-Malerei is the order of the day. Painting just in black and white is the order of the day. An honest assessment will make us aware, however, that both sides of the divide engage in disinformation and what in modern terminology is fashionably described as hybrid warfare. Not only truth in its most essential sense as a core value of democracy, but also the integrity of culture is at stake when the emotions of war absorb the rational mind. The rational mind that can alone be the basis of responsible decisions for the common good. Blocking access to radio and TV stations and to internet sites, excluding people from performing or participating in cultural events and scholarly or academic exchange in general, victimizing civil society for the sake of war mobilization is intrinsically antithetical to democratic values. The war hysteria of these days here in Europe, to me, seems to be an eerie reminder of the mass emotions that accompanied Europe's stumbling into the First World War. It was too late when the people, including some of the leading intellectuals of the time, such as Thomas Mann, Max Planck, Max Weber, it was too late when the people woke up from their illusions, as we know. In our nuclear era, escalating mass emotions are even more consequential because the survival of humankind may be at stake if emotions are allowed to dominate. As President Kennedy presciently said in his famous peace speech of 1963, few months before his tragic assassination, it is not enough anymore to think about how to secure peace in our time. In the face of arms of mass destruction, humanity must strive to establish conditions of peace for all time, or in the words of Immanuel Kant, whom I already earlier mentioned, of perpetual peace, ewiger Friede, in his words. This can only be achieved if the genuine will, or genuine, let me say it like this, if genuine democracy is preserved over or will prevail over despotism or over the rule of powerful interest groups that take the entire state hostage. In a free republic, the citizens exercise their will on the basis only of their own sovereign judgment, so to speak. Decisions about war and peace cannot be delegated to those who do not openly and transparently declare their own interests. And this brings me to my final considerations. I try to cut the presentation short. Under conditions of conflict and war, such as those right now, not only truth may be a casualty, democracy itself risks to become a victim of the mass mobilization of emotions. Ethnic hatred, racial prejudice, or enemy stereotypes always flourish when states engage in a contest of power, and usually that will result in, this contest of power may result in armed confrontation. Hope in the resilience of democracy will not be enough in such an emergency. In the best democratic tradition, civil society must step up and challenge the official narratives and on all sides. Where governments fail, that's how I would put it, citizen diplomacy can demonstrate that there are alternatives to prolonged and cruel confrontation. This is where the resilience of democracy will actually be put to the test, and where the democratic ideal can prove its relevance more than in any other context. It would be a fateful mistake and a bad omen for humanity should the political leaders not pay attention to the manifold popular initiatives for peace. And there are several examples also now those days here in Germany in terms of large, how should I say, movements formulating appeals in using the new social media, and also in terms, very soon we shall see, of the organization of large-scale demonstrations in the United States and here in Europe, including in Germany. Since the creation of the United Nations after World War II, one of the greatest challenges to our common humanity has been how to establish a system of international relations that takes into account the interdependence of democracy and peace, with which I began my presentation. The determination to practice tolerance and live together in peace with one another as good neighbors. These are the words in the preamble of the United Nations Charter. This cannot be interpreted in any other way. These goals cannot be interpreted in any other way. While in times of war, democracy, as I said, is put to the test like in no other situation, democracy is nonetheless the only antidote to the logic of war. I do not see in modern society any other antidote that would be valued globally and accepted on a universal basis. In view of the democratic ideal, which is rooted in the inalienable human right to freedom, humankind should not set its hopes merely on an absence of war that may result from a rational fear of mutual assured destruction. That's the term of a strategic theory from the superpower era. Humankind should rather commit itself to genuine, and that means lasting peace, in the spirit of democratic cooperation among all nations as equals. This is what Immanuel Kant envisaged as perpetual peace. And it is what today's world order, built on the privileged role of the militarily most powerful countries in the United Nations, is not yet able to deliver. And with that, I conclude my presentation, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hans. Are there any questions? It's not working. We pressed it.
Work. Look, I made it work.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you. So, any questions? You must have questions.
Oh.
You will not pass your course if you don't ask questions. Okay, Dr. Hans, you mentioned something about disinformation. How do you suggest dealing with disinformation and fake news, not just in times of war, but also in times of peace? Disinformation that can derail public opinion for political agendas rather than address the truth or seeking the truth.
One means to deal with this is related to the development of technology, as far as I can see. In this period of the internet and the new social media, an individual is able to circumvent official censorship, so to speak, and to circumvent also the mainstream media, and to publish his or her opinion or information in a way that makes it accessible virtually to the entire world, to all who are interested. We have seen one example recently, I cannot go here into detail, in a case where the government would say, no, we will give you no information, even we will give no information to the Intelligence Committee of the National Parliament, because the supreme interest of the state is at stake. So if we are kept totally in the dark concerning certain events, we can never make any mature judgment on what the course of the government should be, for instance, concerning the war. And in such a situation, there are individuals, and I recall now at least 2 of them, very prominent, 3 indeed, very prominent in the Western world, in the United States. One is Jeffrey Sachs, and the one is a former minister of Poland in defense and foreign affairs, who have sought to reach the public through their own Twitter account or blog or whatever. And this triggered a debate. And this we have seen also concerning other issues not related to the war situation now. Of course, the problem always also is how to distinguish between genuine information and fake news, and how to be sure that, for instance, this famous economist, world-famous economist, one of the leading, according to Time magazine, one of the leading and most influential intellectuals of the world, Jeffrey Sachs, that it is his, if we read it in a blog, that it is coming from him and not from somebody else. That is often the problem, that intelligence services or governments would secretly create fake identities. That's a big debate also concerning Twitter, in order to promote certain ideas, or, for instance, that they would, secret services, and there are so many instances, I could give the facts concerning things which I have been involved in. Secret services would try to edit entries of Wikipedia, because Wikipedia is also a very important source of information for the international public. But at least such possibilities exist, which did not exist in earlier times, but the risks are also there, and I do not see how to avoid these risks completely, because the alternative would be to establish a kind of truth ministry. I mean, we see what the problems that are related to this in all the debates Elon Musk triggered concerning Twitter. I mean, if the administration of Twitter or Facebook decide, often secretly, what information they consider adequate and what not, and when often after quite a long period of time, people realized that they had been misled also by decisions of those administrators of those interfaces.
Thank you. Any more questions? Please, go ahead. Do you have a microphone? Where's the microphone?
Thank you so much, Dr. Hans. I am Charlotte Verchier. I'm from Cameroon. Dr. Hans has really, he has spoken my mind, because exactly what Doctor said is exactly what I face, or what we face in my country, whereby those who know the history of Cameroon don't understand that Cameroon is divided into 2.
Yes.
The English-speaking part of Cameroon, where I come from, that makes just 2% of the population, and the French section makes 8% of the population. We cannot speak in Cameroon, the Anglophones. It's a big problem. We have a crisis or a war now whereby the Anglophones are being killed in their numbers. This is a cultural crisis, and that's what brings me here from Cameroon. The two cultures, they don't meet. There is one that is so dominant, and another one is trying to be, it's wiped out, let me say that. I am from that culture that is wiped out. Dr. Hans, the world has been silenced. Since 2017, Anglophones are killed because we are minority, because of our culture, our background. It happens that the Germans colonized us. After the First World War, we were divided between the French and the British. Now, that small percentage, it's being wiped out completely. What can we do? How can we use this how can we blend this, the English and the French culture, to bring a lasting peace to our country? Because the issue is that there is one part that is dominant and another is being considered a minor part. I would like Dr. Hans to give me tips on how, when I go back to my country, I can try to encourage fellow Cameroonians like me, especially the English-speaking part, of which if I talk like this in my country, I won't go free. How can we do to see into it that we use this blend of cultures to bring a lasting peace to my country? Thank you very much.
If I may just briefly say, I do remember, by the way, some years ago, I visited your country, and I went to the beautiful town of Boué, which was the German administrative capital long ago. And I was in also in the area of Douala, of course. So the problem is, as you have already noticed or alerted us about, that almost nothing reaches the international public. And that somehow relates to privileged relationships between the ruling elite in a country such as Cameroon and those countries or institutions that dominate still global information. The situation, I think, would be different if people here in Europe or in the United States and other parts of the world would be aware that it is that there is such a democratic imbalance, to put it mildly, where only the interests of a small minority are properly expressed or properly dealt with. But the other aspect, of course, is, and that could have a certain impact also on situations at the domestic, at the local level, if there would be an international awareness. We have seen that in so many cases. And in many cases, when the constellation of interests was accordingly, particularly Western media did mobilize almost the entire world for certain causes in Eastern Europe or wherever. But nothing of that sort happens concerning a situation in an African country. And in my view, this is also an example of the risks or structural problems inherent in an exclusive representative model of democracy. When there is no element of direct democracy or of referendum, I assume in the Constitution of Cameroon there is no such system, that decisions on vital issues would be made by referendum. That means in a form in which every citizen's vote, whether he is from the English-speaking or French-speaking community, has the same weight. The problem of democratic representation is also a problem of doctrine, because and also here in Europe, according to our state doctrine in Germany and in Austria, those who are members of the legislative assembly, that means those who make the laws, the deputies, are free in the exercise of their mandate. According to the doctrine, each deputy represents or acts on behalf of the common good of the entire people and is not bound by any instructions. But in reality, it's totally different. The deputies vote according to the instructions they get from their party. And that, of course, will create huge democratic imbalances. By the way, in Austria, we are rather, for me, it's really surprising. In Austria, we are quite honest about it. In Austria, we use the term Clubzwang. That means the force that is employed to induce members of a parliamentary group, which we call club, of party 1, party 2, and so on, the force by which they are obliged to vote in a certain sense. And these structural problems of representative democracy, where commitment to one's conscience actually is just a commitment to one's party or one's sponsor, becomes even much more serious in a situation when you have these community rifts or ethnic rifts between the different groups, and that can tear a country even apart, unfortunately.
Thank you, Dr. Hans. Thank you.